Hi, this is Brennan Davis from Bedrock Games and the Bedrock blog, and tonight I want to talk about encounters. I had a series of encounters this session. You can go into the blog, see sessions 11 and 12 of the Paths from Nowhere campaign. And this is just going to be a quick discussion, but I thought it would be a good opportunity for me to talk how I approach encounters. There's nothing particularly deep about this. This isn't, this is just sort of normal standard operating procedure, but I'm noticing a lot of people like hearing the standard operating procedures that I follow. So if people find it beneficial, fine. So in the campaign, and if you've been following it at all, you'll see that they're in the Banyan region. The TNs there tend to be a little bit high for travel. In Ogregate, every day, basically every hex of travel, you have to make a survival roll, and I think that on average they have 2d10 on their survival skills. One of the players was traveling alone and had 0d10, so he was pretty in a more difficult situation, but he only had about a day of travel. But once things kicked in, the two of the characters were together in an area called High Ping Sector, High Ping Valley, and they had to travel, I think it was like 5 days. And so they had to make essentially 5 survival rolls to get to where they wanted to go. And 5 days had to elapse. And I was going back and forth between each, because the party was split. I was going back and forth between them. But they made their survival rolls, and I think the first or the second day they failed. And so then whenever I do the rolls on the random tables, I usually have the players roll I use 2d10 tables, and I have the players roll them so that everybody knows that it's above board, and that I'm not it kind of keeps me honest with my random encounters. And so, and again, I'm not like a stickler for, you have to, like random encounters are sort of a thing where the encounter table is a tool, so I don't worry too much about if you want to adhere to the roll or not. But I like sort of forcing myself to stick with the roll. It kind of it pushes me to do things I might not otherwise do. That's why I like them. And it was a demon moon. The demon moon is a period where number one, obviously it's a demon moon. Demons are prevalent. Spirited beasts, that kind of thing, are prevalent. It's kind of like, it's basically like the spooky month of the setting. And when that month is occurring, instead of rolling on the normal table, so like they were in, I think, the Jianshu forest, so they would have normally rolled on the Jianshu table. I was rolling on the Demon Moon table. And so their first roll was a 17. And a 17 is a painted death. And so for that encounter, again, what I first try to think of is, okay, what is and for those who don't know, painted death is basically like the monster from Painted Skin. It's a woman who underneath is some kind of hideous demon or monster or corpse, but outside she's sort of painted on a skin that makes her look beautiful and like a normal person. And in the setting, the painted skin creatures not just but need to eat human flesh. So I was thinking, okay, well, what is a painted skin creature doing here? And I decided that to make it a little bit interesting, I'll have had instead of like my standard thing that I might do if I know I have a monster and it's going to attack the party, is what direction is the monster coming from to attack the PCs. That's sort of the maybe like the most boring default encounter. But what I ended up doing was, I thought, well, I'll have a scenario that they kind of stumble upon where it's not quite clear what's going on. And so I imagined that there was a painted death that attacked a merchant already. It was about to eat him when she heard the PCs approaching. And so what she ends up doing is she ends up climbing up on a rock and pretending that she was the wife of the merchant that she just killed, and that they were attacked by Yaksha demons. And so the players come, and initially they start buying her story, but as they pay more attention to the scene around them, She said, for example, that she was heading north and she wanted to go with the party if they would escort her, but they noticed that the tracks were coming from the north. There were a few other things that didn't add up, so they eventually they didn't buy her story, and they essentially bid her a good day, and then she attacked them. What I like about a situation like that is it gives the players a chance to kind of interact with things, to sort of figure out what's going on. There's a degree of suspense because they don't know what the situation is, and also it doesn't necessarily lead directly to combat. If they had agreed to take her north, she would have gone with them, and it's unclear what would have happened from that point. If she was going to kill one of them, if she was going to basically just use them to get access to another person. I didn't quite know exactly where it was going to go. And then when they did fight her, and they had nearly dispatched her, she was essentially pleading for mercy and was offering her services in terms of not her services, but servitude. And so, in exchange for her life. And I decided during that moment that all of her offerings were she would honor. Like if they said, okay, we'll take you in, if you we'll let you live, but you have to help us in some way, she would have done that. And she would and I could have thought of a few ways where she would be useful for them in terms of handling certain enemies, that kind of thing. Because the way that I run a monster like this is like, yes, they're vicious, yes, they're monstrous, but they do have a brain. They are capable of forming attachments to people and developing loyalties. So when you approach a monster that way, especially in a setting like this, I find that it makes for more interesting encounters because they can veer into other directions. Now, in the end, they didn't heed her request for mercy, so they just dispatched her. But the point is, it could have gone a totally different direction. This could have been, by the end of the session, they could have had this painted death traveling with them. So I like that a random roll on the encounter table led to that. Also, just in terms of how I was sort of putting together the encounter as a result of the table, that's sort of the way that I like to do things. Now, the other character, immediately after this, he rolled and he failed, and he rolled an 11 on the encounter table, which is a snake demon. And so my first thought was, well, that's kind of similar to what the other players just rolled. They got a painted death, so I don't want to do like something too close to that. And so the only thing that I could really come up with that I thought was interesting was, well, what if the snake demon is already in a fight with somebody? And I thought, well, okay, we'll do kind of like a Madam Whitesnake thing, and there'll be instead of a monk or an abbot, there's going to be a nun, and the nun is fighting with the snake. But the thing is, the player isn't going to necessarily know who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. And so the player stumbles on the scene and he sees the nun, and he sees she doesn't present as a snake woman. She looks more like she looks like a human. And so she's, looks like a green robed swordswoman basically. And the nun is attacking her, and the green robed swordswoman / snake demon, says, hey, help me, this woman's crazy. And then the nun is saying, don't listen to her, she's a demon. And so the player is getting this constant back and forth between these two characters and not sure if one of them's crazy, if one of them's a demon. He does know it's the demon moon, but he's still not sure. And so the player takes his time. He actually waited long enough that there were 2 rounds of exchange between the two characters. And so the snake stabbed the nun, and then the nun and the snake stabbed each other on the following round. And then at that point, the player decided to act, and he sided with the nun. And the nun turned out to be really helpful. And so she actually had the other players in their next encounter encountered hungry ghosts and were afflicted with malignant wind disease. And so by the time they rendezvoused with this player, they were 3 days away from death, and the nun was the one who happened to have the ritual that would enable them to expel these winds of death that had settled on them. So it was an interesting thing. And also, what I liked about that was both of the allying with either of those characters would have been viable in different ways. It wouldn't necessarily have led to if he picked the wrong one, he's then getting killed. The snake demon didn't necessarily want to kill him. Again, I think when you sometimes combats or encounters need to be malicious and aggressive and just going for the party. That's important. But I figure, every once in a while that needs to happen, and a lot of the other encounters are going to be a little more nuanced, a little bit more role play oriented. And so that's the kind of thing that I look to do. And again, that was just a snake demon entry, so there was no nun. I just kind of added that. But I think whenever I get an entry, because I generally prefer simple entries on encounter tables, I just have like Raksha Demon, Chi Spirit, this is the Demon Moon tables. Oh, I apologize for the coughing. Yenli Priests, I think, are like the most benevolent thing that you could probably encounter on this table. Maybe, yeah, I think so. I'd have to look through it more thoroughly, but it was just a snake demon entry, and so I had to kind of think and elaborate. And the same thing with the Painted Death. I had to kind of think and elaborate on what's the situation. And the merchant in that scenario, I decided was like a turquoise merchant and all these things. And so I find if you can sort of fill in those kind of details, that's generally very helpful. But yeah, so again, I've talked about this a little bit in other podcasts, but I just wanted to kind of address a specific example that came from the table and wasn't like I'm making up an example for the purposes of a podcast. I wanted to kind of show, okay, this is these are the things that are I just did like an hour ago in my session. It's more like 4 or 5 hours ago, but you get the point. And yeah, so I guess the key thing is when you're rolling on the random encounter tables, if you're and again, do what you want, but if you're interested in how I approach it, it's that you look at the entry and as I've said in other podcasts, you ask, well, why is this thing here? Why is this person here? Why is this group here? And then you also kind of go a little bit of a step further. You say, what can I do to make this interesting? Just create a more engaging situation. I find a lot of times that starts with the motivation of whoever it is that you're picking, but it can also be by adding other characters. You could roll on the table again. You could just sort of come up with something that feels appropriate. I find that, like in the case of the nun, it was just kind of obvious as I sort of was thinking it through that the nun was an appropriate choice and an interesting choice, and one that like I instantly clicked with. I think that's the other thing, is you want to make sure you're clicking with it. It doesn't necessarily have to be the most brilliant thing. It doesn't have to be, like not everything has to be a 10, right? Because you're doing like these are encounters. They were literally rolling, like almost the whole session was just rolling as they traveled through the wilderness, and they would have these encounters, and so not every single one of them has to be a 10, but they have to be engaging. And so I find the more you create a situation that the players can engage like that, like again, the nun and the demon snake bickering and the player not necessarily knowing who's who and what they're doing, and kind of there being a little bit of a mystery about what's going on, or the Painted Death, where she has her own motives, and she's pulling a deception on the party, and there's kind of a preceding event. The other thing about that is when you do that sort of thing, like I say, okay, I imagine this scenario where there's a dead man on the ground. There's this woman who appears to be a beautiful rich woman, sort of huddled up on a stone as if she's terrified, and there's all of these fallen stones, like turquoise stones, that the merchant was carrying. And you have to think in your head, okay, the merchant was killed by the woman. She didn't have a chance to eat him yet, so she huddled up on the stone when she heard the players approaching. And then you have to think, okay, where did this guy come from? What's her story? What's her excuse? You have to kind of get a sense of how intelligent she's going to be about it. And so I decided that she was probably a pretty capable liar, and she had already, and I also had to decide what information she had. So I know she's going to pretend to be the guy's wife. I had to decide, does she know his name or not? That's a very crucial piece of information. So I decided that before the players interacted with the scene, so that I knew when the players, it was sort of like it wasn't like a quantum ogre type situation. It was something where if the players pursued that, they would get an honest answer. So, those kinds of things. And yeah, it's I find that the more and more you do it, the better you get. Some nights are better than others. This was, I would say, an average day. This is like very indicative of an average day for me. And I would say when I'm more on the ball, the scenarios are really, they click to me for me even more. And when I'm less on the ball, then that's when I sort of revert to more like, the monster stumbles out of the woods and attacks you. And it's okay to do that kind of thing. You can't, again, when you're looking, especially at a sandbox, but like a long-term campaign, you're really thinking in terms of longevity. You're not thinking in terms of, that one particular session being, crazy good, or having a short series of sessions that are like, an incredible adventure. You're thinking more in terms of, week to week play. And again, you in order to do that, I feel like you have to relax a little bit more and not have those kinds of expectations in your head. It sounds like a lowering of expectations, but what that actually leads to is, in my opinion, better quality game, because you're relaxed and you're not sweating it, and you're not like, oh my God, it's got to be so great. I apologize. my medication alarm. I have to take antibiotics. But yeah, so that's basically all I had to say. I'll try to come back on and talk about this again. This was for this, again, like I said, it's the 12th session of my Paths from Nowhere campaign, and it's one of these campaigns where this one is very fluid. It's very, I don't have any particular sense of direction. There are things kind of hanging in the background that emerge as threats occasionally because of lingering complications and that sort of thing. But it's really up to the players to sort of do what they want to do and look for what they want to look for. And it's a very effective approach, I find. And my Friday game is, you could say, like a little bit more driven in a way, like story driven. Not story driven, that's the wrong term, but there's like a more of an engine to that game. And this one is more, let's see what happens. So yeah, but in both of them, when I do random encounters, it's the same kind of deal. And I think the only downside, I will say, if you have your players rolling on the encounter table, which I don't necessarily recommend, I just like to do it to keep myself honest, is if they roll and then they roll again and they get the same number, they kind of know what it is already. So in that instance, what I either do, what I did tonight, was just have them re-roll, or you can, once something's chosen, you can just kind of like in your notes mark down another thing that'll be in that slot. So if they rolled a 17, that was a pain of death, you can write down 17 and then say, Gianchi, or roll in the grudge table, or Toad Demon, or whatever it is. So yeah. So I will let you go, and until next time, I will talk to you later.